We're going to discuss the letter from a Birmingham jail written by Martin Luther King Jr. In April of 1963 when he had been imprisoned in Birmingham, Alabama for political action, for participating in demonstrations against segregation there, as he explains. And he writes it in particular in response to a letter by 8 clergymen, 7 Christian and 1 Jewish clergy. A text called A Call for Unity that had been put out on the 12th of April receives this reply from King on the 16th of April, a reply that he penned on the margins of newspapers and scraps of paper that he was able to obtain in jail until his lawyers could bring him an actual notepad. With the letters of Paul, we don't have the benefit of having the original letters or the letters afterwards. We only have Paul's letter. With Martin Luther King Jr.'s material, we at least have the call for unity.
What I really love about the address of this, my dear fellow clergymen, is that it's a response, and it's a kind of it's a bit of respect to these people who are recognized as clergy in their community. But he's calling them his fellow clergymen. He's like, I'm a clergyman too. I also have this kind of authority and respect, and I have the authority to make the claims that I'm about to make, and I also command respect in a religious community. And so I find it a really interesting way to address his colleagues, and it really sets himself on an equal playing field with them at the very beginning.
And he really does set forth a collegial tone. He starts out saying, basically, I get lots of criticisms that I ignore, but I feel that since you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statements in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. So in that community of clergy colleagues, he's saying, all right, let's have a reasonable discussion about this.
I think in a way that is similar in some ways to what we saw Paul doing early in Galatians, he's kind of coming out to argue against, in a collegial tone, people who are on one level on the same team as him. These clergymen who he are addressing are not saying that segregation should remain in Alabama or anywhere, but they're arguing that the civil disobedience that Dr. King and those working with him are enacting is not the right way of going about it. There should be some negotiation, and these other sorts of more civil ways of doing things will eventually bring it into this. It's a sort of different approach that is what's being argued about. So it's interesting that the impetus for the letter is a kind of corrective on somebody else who is ostensibly on the same team, in a similar way that it seems like Paul is negotiating between different apostles who may or may not be, but likely are all giving different accounts of what the good news is relating to Jesus Christ. So it's kind of like another representative almost of infighting amongst people who are all ostensibly working towards the same ends.
I see that address in the beginning as well with the if I took the time to answer all the criticisms that come across my desk. I see that it's collegial, but it's got a little dig to it.
Yeah.
It's definitely got this sense, because later on in the letter he's like saying he's literally weeping over the laxity of the church in not responding to these issues of segregation. And so it's this really great, I think also implicit in that is I'm so busy doing my ministry work and work for justice that I don't have time to answer all these criticisms. But the choice to respond to these group of fellow clergymen is also really interesting. And I think it is done in a sense of collegiality. But there's also, I think, from the beginning, a little bit of seriousness there.
I love the first lines because just as when we read New Testament or ancient texts, it's so hard to tell a sense of humor or tone. I think that's a little bit what you're getting at here. It's even hard in a letter from 1963. My dear fellow clergymen, I think you all are absolutely right. He could have said, my dear, let me find the names, Bishop Carpenter, my dear Bishop Durick, my dear Rabbi Groffman, but he doesn't do that, right? He creates a kind of community, right? Which is really interesting because by the second paragraph, that question of space and stakes that I think Greg was referring to in Galatians as well emerges. Why am I here in Birmingham? What does it mean that there are outsiders coming in, right? Who's outside? Who's inside? Who's outside what? You know, is it about Birmingham? Is it about Christian practice? Is it about people of faith or Judeo-Christian practice? But in those first lines, he kind of evokes space, right? While confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. It's like, you know, this sort of like, I just had the leisure to flip through my materials. And then he actually says, you know, as you all notice, seldom do I pause. If I had to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, and at least when I was reading it, I imagined him sitting behind a rather large desk with, all of a sudden he's talking about secretaries having little time. You know, you get this sort of picture in your mind, and then you realize, actually, historically speaking, he's in jail and he's writing this on the marginalia of newspapers. By the end of the letter, in what I think is what we call in New Testament studies a ring structure, right? How do you bring back something at the beginning or the end, or how do you create these kind of defined spaces within your writing? He says, never before have I written so long a letter. I'm afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. So I love that movement where you you pan sort of from that desk with the secretaries, the busyness of his important schedule in terms of his justice work, his ministerial work, to the reality. What else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell than write long letters? You know, it's just to me, a very powerful rhetorical evocation of space, really.
And he's kind of simultaneously saying, on the one hand, I wouldn't normally devote this much time and energy to replying to dignifying such criticism with a response. On the other hand, I'm afraid it's much too long to take your precious time, as in, I don't think you're actually going to read all of this. But in addressing the form of the letter, that it's really long, it's as if the form itself, at the end of the letter, as you kind of close, after it has gone on for pages and pages and pages and pages, the form itself becomes an argument because it references why he is sitting alone in prison, why he has the time to make this argument at this length, and he sort of harnesses the entire time that we have sat there reading the entire thing into a kind of meditation on why he's there in the first place. Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant rhetorical move and certainly very powerful.
Other things you notice about how he presents himself really within the first few pages especially, but maybe elsewhere you found something particularly interesting about how he presents himself in the letter?
Well, he connects himself to a prophetic tradition explaining why he's here in Birmingham. It's because there's injustice here, and says, just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their, thus saith the Lord, far beyond the boundaries of their hometown, saying, and then goes on with Paul, and Jesus says, I'm a part of this tradition that goes where injustice is and speaks to that injustice, which is pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He also connects himself to, I guess, a philosophical tradition. So he talks about freedom, and he talks about inevitability, and he talks about just and unjust laws. So whether or not people are able to place some of the things that he says, it's clear that there are all these traditions that back him, and therefore implicitly establish him as a person who should be listened to. So it's like, I'm part of this community, I'm part of this other tradition, I'm just an all-round, well-read, knowledgeable person. And all of that sort of advances his agenda in his letter.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that he's at the same time is kind of able to reference, while in a prison cell, Paul Tillich and Thomas Aquinas and Socrates, and kind of use that kind of academic, well-educated credentialing. But he also he's familiar with the extremely local context of what is going on in Birmingham. He talks about the specificity of what's been going on. He mentions Eugene Connor, and so there's this. He has authority of knowing the local situation,
despite being accused of being an outsider. But he's also drawing on, like you were saying, this much larger kind of academic tradition and tradition of well-respected philosophers and theologians that are respected, presumably, by a large number of clergymen.
So not only does he refer to Thomas Aquinas, I don't know, who else did you mention?
Like Martin Buber,
Yeah,
Paul
exactly,
Tillich,
exactly.
Like
So-
that he's able to do this.
Right.
Yeah, so not only Christian, but also Jewish prominent thinkers, and then back to the long tradition of Socrates, who was more or less forced to commit suicide in the context of a court in Athens for being a gadfly, right? For being the kind of philosopher that provoked people to think about things. That he can place himself within that tradition, which frankly, early Christians placed themselves within really explicitly in the 2nd century. They said, we suffer like Socrates, Christ suffered like Socrates. So it's a really great movement. So we talked a little bit about, Tyler brought up this question of, answered the question of how does King present himself, talking about his paragraph where he says, just as the prophets of the 8th century, just like Paul was called to the Macedonians to aid them. And he also very carefully and precisely in the paragraph before says exactly why he's there, right? I am the president of this association of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and very clearly sort of explains those networks.
I think that this is an excellent opportunity to think a little bit about what letters are for and who the audience of letters are. I mean, as a sort of genre. Often when we write emails to friends, or even if those of us who do still actually write and mail letters, the idea, I think, more often than not, is that these are private documents that we are sharing with one other person or a couple other people. I wouldn't necessarily expect any of my emails that I write to friends, even sort of lengthy, well thought out ones that I spend a lot of time on, to ever be published. This is a letter specifically responding to a published letter. Actually, I'm not exactly sure if the original document that this is replying to was published in the form of a letter, but in any case, this is replying to a piece that was published in the newspaper there.
Yeah, not a letter, but a sort of we, the undersigned clergy, and then signed
Make this
by.
statement.
Right. So
Yeah.
Right.
yeah.
So the idea, especially, and then when we get to this passage that we've already touched on at the very end, where he says, he's not sure, I'm afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. The your being the identified, my dear fellow clergymen, at the beginning of the letter. But especially when you get to the very end of this, it's very clear that, there's the writer and the addressee, there's Dr. King and the clergyman, but there's an entire audience that's perpendicular to this, that I think he's really shooting for when he is making this argument to the clergyman. He definitely, as Jen said, has some very strong words for the church, and he's with this sort of group of clergymen who represent different, both Christianity and Judaism, different denominations. He can sort of talk about the church globally in a sort of ecumenical way when he's saying that the church is failing African Americans at this time. But I don't think he's specifically trying to change the minds of any of these individuals who made this statement and published it. He is writing a letter to them to make an argument to a much broader audience. So without getting into specifics about textual transmission and copying and that kind of thing in the ancient world, I think it just could go ahead and suffice to say that when Paul is writing letters to the ecclesia in Galatia or in Rome, he might not always just be writing to the ecclesia in Galatia or Rome or Philippi or Thessaloniki. There might also be this understanding there that there's a kind of wider net that's being cast with the occasion of making an argument to a particular person. You can also make points to a broader swath.
I think you can even see it's such a different context, but you can even see this at the end of this letter when he, after this good, reasonable argument, answering the questions of this letter, he says, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church.
Right.
I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who is nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. So church there does not just mean these this small group of clergymen. It's exactly like you say. It's this broader swath of people, and there's even a reaching out to that direct audience there, I think. So there's definitely an awareness that this is a public communication.
So we want to think about different sort of technologies of publication that would be going on in the first century versus the 20th century. But nevertheless, the question of audience is a really interesting one. I think we could think about how to separate off the inscribed audience and the actual audience, by which I mean there's an actual audience, presumably of 8 people with whom he is both extremely respectful and extremely disappointed on some level. And yet they're characterized in a given way that they may or may not agree with. And then there's this more expansive audience that Jennifer was just arguing sort of moves outward in the text in a way that's really similar to the way he moves outward spatially. So he says, he's addressing this question about the actions being unwise and untimely, he's quoting, and then he says, are we outsiders coming in, which is an accusation that's made in the Call for Unity document. And he basically says, well, what really is the outside? You know, can you really just delimit this problem to Birmingham and say, these people are from Atlanta, they're coming over into Birmingham? Or is this a broader question of the church in the passage you were just saying? Or is it a broader question, he literally says, of America? If injustice is happening in one part of America, it is not limited to Birmingham as a problem, right? It extends outwards. And so too, I think you all are seeing kind of elasticity in his audience. In the case of Paul, I think one thing that's really helpful to think about is there weren't Xerox machines, there weren't printing presses, right? But one thing that we immediately want to consider is the way in which reading something out loud, maybe not just once, but multiple times in ecclesia, in assembly, is a kind of different medium for communicating, for having people hear, debate, discuss, talk, take it out from there, come back together. So I just find that kind of mechanical question that's provoked really interesting too. And he says, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. I'm quoting now. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. So he goes back to the book of Daniel, written in the 2nd century BCE, but referring to a much earlier period in Jewish history, the story of Jewish resistance. It was practiced superbly, he goes on, by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. You know, extending that history broader. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience using a nice Athenian imprimatur, right, going back to classical Athens, and then in our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. It's a wonderful moment where he pulls together all these very short names or phrases that can evoke entire stories for people of where they belong within history. What narratives really form and compel them to act?